to another episode of Pit Lane Parlay.
Welcome to another episode of Pit Lane Parlay. My name is host Mike Jokum. My pal Frank Santoroski joins me as we do another Lost Tracks special episode. This one on Riverside International Raceway. So Frank, how you doing tonight? And thanks for joining again.
Oh, man, thanks for having me on. I mean, it's a pleasure to do these. You know, I think that there's so much racing history out there that a lot of young people just don't know. So it pleases me to, just help kind of educate folks, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. There's some really cool stuff out there that, like Riverside that I never saw even on TV, but still really cool to talk about. Riverside, known a lot for a handful of Indycar races, a bunch of NASCAR races, a bunch of IMSA races, a Formula One race. IROC raced here. So that's a quick little overview. It's a pretty cool looking track. Just it was outside of LA, a couple hours south of Laguna Seca, and probably pretty close to Long Beach. So where do you want to start?
Oh, well, I mean, honestly, if the movie The Wizard of Oz was about abandoned racetracks, Riverside would be the Scarecrow. And why is that? Because as Dorothy said, Scarecrow, I think I'll miss you most of all, because Riverside was genuinely liked, but it was a real driver's track. The drivers liked it, the teams liked it, the series that raced there liked it. They were in a great metropolitan area. They put on a good show. It was very fan friendly. There were great viewing angles. So it's sad that it's gone. They had a 32-year history. The original owner was a guy named Ed Pauley. I believe it was some sort of automobile testing facility kind of company started building the track, and they ran out of money, and then Ed Pauley and some of his backers took over the project, and they opened the track in 1957. Now Ed was more of a hands-off owner. The president of Riverside Raceway and the director of operations was a fellow named Les Richter, and Les he's a Hall of Fame football player. He played the Los Angeles Rams. He was well known in the LA area, but a big race guy. I mean, he even had a stint during his career as the director of race operations for NASCAR. I mean, this guy was well versed in auto racing and the perfect guy to run the facility. And he ran that facility until they changed ownership years and years later. But let's talk about the layout of the track. The track was, in its long course, 3.3 miles, 9 turns. And there were several different configurations they could make out of that. Like some of the club racing facilities you see today, where they have multiple places they can shut off the track, but they had several different configurations they could use. They could run it clockwise or they could run it counterclockwise. They had a shorter course. They had a half-mile oval within the facility there. So there were a lot of different things that they could do with Riverside, and it had very long straightaways and very tight turns. In particular, the back straightaway was quite long and downhill, and at the end of that straightaway was turn 9, which was a 180-degree turn, hairpin, and it was fast. And I mean, you would literally destroy the brakes trying to slow down for that thing if you wanted to get your maximum speed on the straightaway, and it ended up being one of the most dangerous part of the course as well. Now we've talked about in some of our other shows about tracks that were inherently dangerous, and Riverside certainly had that reputation. There were, in the 32-year history of Riverside, 21 fatalities, including a fatality in their very first race meeting in 1957. A fellow named John Lawrence went off the track in turn 9 and through the wall, and then he died about 2 days later of the head injury. So, and then over the years, I mean, we nearly lost AJ Foyt there in '65. Had a horrendous wreck where they thought he was dead at the scene. NASCAR champ Joe Weatherly lost his life there. Rolf Stomlin, the only fatality ever in an IMSA GTP race happened at Riverside. Rolf Stomlin. And of course, Ken Miles, there's a renewed interest in Ken Miles because of the new Ford versus Ferrari film, where Christian Bale did a fine job of portraying Ken. He also lost his life testing at Riverside, and 1966, which was, shortly after the main action of that film. So the track was dangerous, but it was a real driver's track, and people enjoyed the challenge. And events there, the NASCAR guys were there as early as the late 50s, and the very close to the beginning of NASCAR. NASCAR began in 1949. Within 10 years, Riverside was their West Coast home for up all the way through 1989 before they started racing at Sonoma, right to the end of Riverside. But NASCAR would host two races out there. They had what they call the Winston West. In the early days, it was the West before Winston came on board. But a lot of the regular Grand National or Cup guys would run that one as well, just because they liked the challenge of the track.
Yeah, going back to the layout, looking at the back straightaway and using my not so good math skills, it looks like the back straightaway was just about a mile long, which is pretty intense for a road course, especially when you're going downhill into turn 9. And I'm just reading about AJ Foyt's brake failure. You have to wonder how many guys had brake failures at such a point when you're going 160, 170 miles an hour down to a 180-degree turn.
Yeah, now they did in the late, I want to say after 1967, after another fatality at turn 9, they did reprofile the turn. They put a little bit of a dog leg out there, and they actually widened the turn to make it a little safer, but but they still lost Rolf Stallman there after they reprofiled the turn. So it was a bit of a dangerous area, but every track's got that spot that's just tough and it's difficult, and if you can master it, you're doing very well. So another interesting thing about Riverside was because of its proximity to Los Angeles. It was often used for movies and television and to film commercials. They film tons of car commercials. You always see the car commercial with, professional driver on a closed course. Well, Riverside was the place to do that. And there are a bunch of motion pictures where scenes were filmed there. And a lot of times, like any TV show where you needed a car chase, they dress up the back straightaway to look like a freeway and film a car chase there rather than closing down streets in downtown Los Angeles. So it was very much used. And one of the things, when I was a little kid, one of the first movies I really liked was the original Herbie the Love Bug. And there are a bunch of the racing scenes in Herbie were filmed at Riverside, and they mentioned the track several times. We're gonna get the big race coming up at Riverside. So it's widely used in popular culture. Riverside is just based on its proximity to Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm looking at the movie and TV list here. First off, the original Herbie the Love Bug is fantastic, and I'm pretty sure I owned that on VHS for many years. Chips, the TV show, was there. The awesome TV show Knight Rider shot there. What else do we have? A Grand Prix, the movie, was shot there in '66, and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, pretty cool that it was used so often, and that back straightaway was so long they could dress it up as a highway for different TV shows and movies and whatnot.
Yeah, here's another interesting Riverside story that some folks may not know. Do you realize Sweet Savage was discovered at Riverside?
No, I did not know that.
It's a fun story. Now, Riverside is known as the house Dan Gurney built, right? Because number one, Dan Gurney won a lot of races there, but Dan would use Riverside a lot for testing his cars and whatnot. He was a regular fixture there at Riverside, and Riverside itself was used just in car testing a ton. I mean, you're talking. Here's a track that, because of number one, the favorable weather, and number two, just the different configurations. This track was booked almost every off weekend that they had from racing for testing. It was highly used. I mean, there was always a busy place. But Sweet Savage was young guy. He was he had done some automobile racing, but he was more of a motorcycle guy. Really, he was a motorcycle racer. He was actually part of the Evel Knievel stunt show. He would warm up act for Evel Knievel, come out and do some tricks on his motorcycle. So he caught wind of the fact that Dan Gurney was going to be there in Riverside. And Sweet Savage, he's a California guy. He didn't live far. He figured he'd just show up at the track, right? So he shows up. I guess security was pretty lax. He just came on in, and he was driving up and down the pit lane on his motorcycle, popping wheelies and showing off, I guess trying to draw some attention to himself. And it worked because a fellow named Monty Roberts, who was a PR guy with Ford, kind of noticed him, and then he says, "Wow, man, that guy, number one, he's just a lot of natural charisma, good-looking guy, brave soul doing his wheelies here." So he opened up a conversation with him, and before you know it, he was signed a contract as a Ford driver. And a couple of weeks later, he's running Holman Moody's car in NASCAR down in Martinsville. So and then from there, Swede worked with Dan Gurney for a while, as well as his career in the USAC. So just interesting, because everyone's there at Riverside. Swede decided to show up and got himself noticed. So that's always a neat story I've liked.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I did not find that in when I was doing my research here, but it looks like I'm going to go back to the layout again because I'm curious to get your input here. Looking at the redesigned layout where they widen turn 9, I can see that it kind of looks like an early predecessor to what is or was Sonoma Raceway or whatever they call it nowadays, with the kind of wide turn 9, kind of a windy, tight, windy section, turns 6, 7, and 8, almost, the turns 2, 3, 4, and 5, where it's kind of like the S's, but not quite. Any thoughts there? Am I completely right, or am I way off base?
It does bear some similarity to Sonoma for sure. I mean, the whole layout, and you could see if you look at a track map that it shows you the old turn 9 and the new turn 9, where they added kind of a little bit of a kink before the turn to widen it out. But Sonoma has that hairpin at the end of the straight, and sometimes it's used, sometimes it's not. You're able to do a configuration where you kind of shorten that. I believe IndyCar's used the shortened one in the past. NASCAR prefers to use the full hairpin there. But yes, it's very similar in look to it. Very similar with the amount of elevation changes. I mean, the thing that you can't always tell just on a track map is the amount of elevation change. And again, that Riverside had a lot of elevation change, and that back straightaway was downhill all the way, and then around the turn and back uphill. Very similar to like the boot at Watkins Glen, where it's got the downhill tight turn and then back uphill. So again, very, very challenging turn for the drivers.
I love it. That sounds awesome. Was the elevation change similar to, say, maybe Laguna Seca and the corkscrew, where it's almost 150 feet when all is said and done?
I don't think it is quite as extreme as Laguna's corkscrew. I think Laguna's corkscrew is quite unique in that sense, but there was quite a bit of elevation change at Riverside. I would say it's kind of similar to like a Bridgehampton, which is it's another lost track, but the elevation changes were similar to that. Or again, like I said, to Watkins Glen.
Awesome. And jumping and looking at specifically the USAC years, and then which was in the late 60s, and CART years, which was in the early 80s. It looks like the USAC years, they used the 2.6 mile layout, and then the CART years, they used the 3.3 mile layout. So I guess they made a change when the faster cars came back there. But any specific or interesting IndyCar anecdotes from the 6 Riverside races?
There were only 6 of them. Dan Gurney won the first 2. I forget who won the third. The 3 CART races, Rick Mears ruled the first 2, and then Bobby Rahal won the last IndyCar race at Riverside. But interestingly enough, Mears has a reputation as a oval specialist. But what a lot of folks don't realize is the early part of Rick's career, he was one of the best on road courses. He really was. And, after he had that horrible accident in Saint-Air up in Canada, where he nearly lost both his feet, it made the road courses a bit more difficult for him. He kind of excelled a little more on the ovals, but in Rick's early days, he was a beast on road courses. He not only won at Riverside, he wiped up the field. but a lot of people, they don't remember that. They remember Rick as the Oval Meister, the Master of Indianapolis. But early in Rick's career, and Rick came out of the SCCA. He's an old Formula V guy. He cut his teeth running road courses. So to kind of cornhole him into being an oval specialist is not doing real justice to his early career. But those are some fine wins for Rick at Riverside back in the early '80s, '81 and '82. That was.
Yeah, honestly, I did not really know that beforehand. So look at that, some Rick Mears knowledge in a Riverside International Raceway episode. So yeah, as I mentioned, there was only 6 races. Dan Gurney won 2, Rick Mears won 2, some guy Mario Andretti won 1, and then Bobby Rahal won the final one at the end of 1983. There's also a Formula One race that I think I mentioned at the beginning.
Yep, 1960. They were trying to get a Grand Prix in the United States. I think in 58 or 59, they held one in Sebring. And then they went to Riverside for 1960. Sterling Moss won that Grand Prix there. And then after that, Watkins Glen successfully bid to host the U.S. Grand Prix, and then it was held there from 1961 through 1980. So, but Riverside did host. There was the Grand Prix of the United States in 1960. Points paying race for the championship. So, and speaking of championships, the races, the USAC races that were held at Riverside were all the season enders. Again, due to the favorable weather in California, those races were held in early December 1st or 2nd for the USAC races. And for a long time, the final race of the season for NASCAR was at Riverside. It was their championship deciding race. Believe it or not, if you think about NASCAR today, this day and age, how it's so strong in oval series and how we try to get a really neutral track for the championship 4 format, whatever you want to call it now. That they used to decide a championship on a road course back in the day, and then prior to 1982 or '83, Riverside was sometimes the season opener for NASCAR. Again, due to the favorable weather there in February, it would be before the Daytona 500. It wasn't until the '80s that Daytona 500 began to open the year for NASCAR. So little bits of Riverside history where it was it was not just another race on the calendar. It was a very important race on the calendar for these different series. Now, again, we really haven't touched on sports cars a lot, but the LA Times Grand Prix was a sports car race, and that was a signature event. Now, sports cars were wildly popular in the 70s. Sports cars and Can-Am racing, and this stuff back then was more popular than stock car racing or open wheel racing. They would have great races there at Riverside, huge crowds. Then later during the IMSA years, they changed that to an endurance race. It was a 6-hour, but that was always their signature race, the LA Times Grand Prix. And these sports car races, you'd have guys like Andretti in there, Foyt. You're talking the Ken Miles and the Carroll Shelbys and all these. Jackie Eakes, all these guys that you're used to seeing at Le Mans and whatnot, and even guys like Jackie Stewart and Graham Hill hopping these sports cars here and then. So that was really, it blows my mind today how sports car racing has taken like almost a 4th seat behind Formula One, NASCAR, IndyCar.
No, it's disappointing.
It's disappointing, but sports car racing was hugely popular during Riverside's heyday, and that was their marquee event. That was their moneymaker.
Yeah, I would have loved to see the old IMSA cars there. Out of sheer curiosity, I'm looking at the race results. The year Sterling Moss won in Formula One, it has the length listed at 5.271. Oh, you know why? That's because
kilometers.
It's in kilometers.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that whole European numbers thing is really confusing me. We're gonna leave that in the episode because that was user error. IROC raced here, raced in Riverside for many years.
Many years, yeah. The first season of IROC, I believe, was in '74, and Riverside was one of the IROC races. I want to say Mark Donohue won the First IROC race
Correct.
at
Yep.
Riverside, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yeah, he won twice there. Mario won. Bobby Unser won. Let's see. I'm trying to pick out some other IndyCar names. Scott Pruitt won in '88, which was the last IROC year. And then Emerson Fittipaldi won 1975. Yeah, so there were some huge winners even in the IROC series that were open wheel related.
Yeah, I mean, IROC's another series I kind of miss. There was, back in the 70s, 80s, it was pretty cool. They used to the first year they had it, everyone had a Porsche Carrera. Then they went to the Camaros or whatever, and they kind of sanitized it and in the later years of IROC they made it favor the NASCAR guys because of the type of car, but early on it was more of a sports car than a stock car in IROC. But that's another neat series that's just gone and lost to us.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, I remember watching the IROC series growing up, and I did not know until just now that it used to be. Well, the first couple of years were a Porsche series, which sounds amazing.
Oh yeah, much better than the IROC Camaro they had in the 90s. So.
Yeah, so we will wrap this up here with kind of how we typically wrap these up. The downfall of Riverside, was it the typical land became more valuable elsewhere sort of issue?
Oh, that's exactly what the issue was. Yep, these housing developments started popping up around, and then they, Ed Pauley and Les Richter got out. They sold the track to a guy named Fritz Duda, who was a racing guy and had every intention of continuing racing. People were kind of glad that they sold it to Fritz rather than selling it to land developers. Fritz tried to hold on for a while. He purchased the track in 1983. By 1988, it was apparent that number one, local opposition to the noise, right, as well as
of course
just the urban sprawl and development coming around there that made it much more attractive to just go ahead and sell it and have them redevelop the property. And they started dismantling the track in 1989. The last major event there was a NASCAR race. In 1988, I believe Ricky Rudd was the winner. Was the last major race there. They did some club racing in '89, a few test sessions, but then they began dismantling the track. And it was a long process. Operations building actually stayed standing until, I believe, 2005. The administration building for the track. It was repurposed, but that eventually went away. The nice thing is that the housing development, there's a shopping mall and several housing developments on the old property. The housing developments there, they've in homage to the track, most of the streets in the developments are named after race car drivers. They're just like Andretti Lane, Gurney Way, Penske Street, Surtees Avenue, Foyt Street. They're all they've done that, and then they took most of the stuff from the administration building and a lot of the memorabilia from the track, and there was a museum that stood for a while in the Riverside area, and it was just hey, this is where the racetrack used to stand. I've got all this stuff in the museum, but eventually even the museum fell into financial trouble and the museum closed in 2012. So literally there's, I think as late as 94, 95, you could still pick out turn 9 and the backstretch on a map, but at now 2019 there's literally nothing left other than memories and old film. And I don't know what's happened to the museum collection. I hope that, I know somebody is tending to that, but it would be nice if somebody would kind of jump in and see if we can get that stuff on display somewhere, maybe in the Indianapolis, museum, or maybe in the NASCAR Hall of Fame museum. But I believe that collection needs to go somewhere instead of in storage.
Yeah, I would love to see what they had there. So for those who are near LA and possibly are curious about driving by to check this out, the handy research I've done here says that on Day Street, there is a Lowe's warehouse where the old Turn 9 used to be. So that is your, go check out the Lowe's there, and we can say that it was Riverside International Raceway. So With that, we'll wrap up another episode here with Riverside. I hope everybody enjoyed one that was not local to the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. Frank and I will be back to do another one of these at some point in the near future. Frank, thank you very much for joining me, and have a good evening, my friend.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on here again. I really enjoyed doing these. So I appreciate you including me always.
Yeah, no problem. And hope everybody enjoyed it, and we'll be back again soon.